Okay, it is 12 o'clock noon, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We know that others will be trickling in, but we want to honor your time and the speaker's time. So I'll go ahead and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second annual Lunch and Learn speaker series. We're really delighted to have you here with us today, and we're very excited about our speaker, Mary Pacheco. The first, I should introduce myself. I'm Diane Bowen Coleman. I'm the State Human Trafficking Abatement Coordinator in the Special Investigation and Prosecution Division of the Department of the Attorney General. And delighted, absolutely delighted to have Mary Pacheco. Mary has been part of the Hina Malka Teen Care Team since 2000 and currently serves as the clinical director. She is a licensed mental health counselor and the qualified mental health professional for the Teen Care Intensive In-Home Program through CAMHD, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Division. Her professional credentials include Certified Substance Abuse Counselor, Certified Prevention Specialist, and Certified Clinical Supervisor. Mary's mission is to empower Hawaii's youth to find hope, health, and healing. Before joining Hina Malka, Mary worked in early childhood education, which inspired her to pursue a master's in counseling psychology at Chaminade University. She holds training credentials in alcohol and drug abuse diagnosis, motivational interviewing, SAMHSA's prevention skills training, prevention ethics, and youth mental health first aid. She is also a trainer with the Hawaii Substance Use Professional Development Program. Mary is a dedicated leader in the field, serving on the board of Hawaii Project Aware 2 and the COSAC Advisory Board at Leeward Community College. Thank you so much, Mary, for being here, and we'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. So I just want to be sure, does everybody see my slides?
Not yet.
Can you, not yet? Okay. But you folks can hear me. All right, here we go. Let me share. All right. Okay. And here we go. So welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you are here. And what we're going to be talking about today is, and the title is Hooked and Trapped. And basically, you're going to walk away with a clear understanding of the linkage between substance use and human trafficking in terms of our youth who are at risk. So I'm so glad that you folks are here. So a couple things. One is when we hear the words human trafficking, many of us picture something far away, right? Hidden, maybe even dramatic, or happening to someone else. But the reality is far closer, quieter, and even more complex. Human trafficking often doesn't begin with force, it begins with vulnerability. And substance use, especially among youth and young adults, can significantly increase that vulnerability. So today when we talk about hooked and trap, we're going to explore the intersection where substance use, trauma, and exploitation collide. We will also examine how substances can be used not only as a coping tool, but also as a mechanism of control, creating dependence, increasing risk taking, as well as limiting a young person's ability to recognize danger or even seek help. So, as helping professionals, we are often in a very unique position. We may be the one which is the very first safe adult that can notice some of these subtle shifts in their behavior, or maybe even unexplained relationships or environmental pressures that signal that something deeper is actually happening. So these signs are rarely obvious, and they often look like typical substance use, defiance, or maybe even just disengagement or perhaps relapse. All right. So before we go any further, I want to name the emotional weight of this topic. So today we're going to be talking about substance use, exploitation, as well as human trafficking involving youth. So, even without the graphic details, these topics can bring up some very strong emotions, especially for those of us who have worked closely with trauma or who carry our own lived experiences. So please know that you are welcome to step away, turn off your camera, stretch, or even just take a break at any point. Your well being matters. And if something comes up for you during or after this training, I really encourage you to reach out to your supervisor, a trusted colleague, or even a mental health professional. Okay? I'm also going to start with sort of an educational disclaimer. And I just want to clarify that this presentation is intended for educational purposes. So the data, the examples, as well as the interpretations shared today are grounded in research and clinical practice, but they also reflect my professional lens. They are not official policy positions of any specific agency or department. This allows us to really stay focused and then learn as well as engage in some reflection and discussion. Okay. All right. So this brings us to self-care. So before we dive into the heavy material, I want us to briefly just check in with ourselves. In the field, we often really are good at taking care of everyone else and not so great at noticing our own needs. But regulation is foundational to ethical care, right? And if we're dysregulated, we miss things. If we're overwhelmed, we default to assumptions. So, in the chat, and Diane's going to help me with this, what I'd like you to do is share one small thing that you did this morning that supported your well being. It can be simple, right? I had my coffee first thing this morning. I got to just take a deep breath in the fresh air when I rise, or maybe just a moment of quiet. Maybe you did some praise and worship, or perhaps even walked your furry family member this morning. Okay, so just go ahead and identify one specific action that you took to support
Okay,
your well
Mary,
being.
we have meditation. I enjoyed the fresh morning air, journaling, spent time in prayer, and read the word. Played
Awesome.
with my cat, said daily affirmations with my husband. I spoke with trusted friends, deep breathing and journaling, drank coffee, and had a lovely conversation with a coworker about faith. Coffee with my husband.
Nice. So, what I'm hearing is there's a
Nice
lot of.
breakfast.
Mhm.
We have a few more coffee and Wordle. Enjoyed the sound of the rain on the windward side before getting out of bed. Stretched, stayed in bed for a while.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing, and more so, just your diligence in terms of engaging in your well-being. And what I kind of heard in terms of a reoccurring theme is sort of the connection, whether it's connection to people, whether it's connection to our faith, whether it's connection to nature. Okay, so thank you all again so much for sharing. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to dive into what are you going to walk away with today? Okay, so here are our learning objectives. So by the end of this session, you should be able to identify how substance use increases vulnerability to trafficking, recognize behavioral as well as contextual red flags, describe trauma informed and culturally responsive strategies, and last but not least, understand the role of prevention and collaboration within substance use treatment. Okay? And again, I just want to emphasize that this is all about awareness. Okay, so substance use and human trafficking frequently overlap, but they're often treated as separate issues. Substance use is rarely just about the substance. For many youth, it is tied to coping, belonging, survival, as well as escape. This makes substance use a significant risk factor, not because youth are making bad choices, but because it can lower protective barriers and increase exposure to unsafe people as well as environments. So trafficking often takes advantage of these type of conditions quietly and gradually. Okay. So as we get started, I'd like to just introduce you all to Kaleo. Okay. So Kaleo is a composite case. In other words, it is not a real person, but it reflects patterns that many of us see. Kaleo is 14, of Native Hawaiian ancestry, and navigating housing instability. He was referred for attendance, as well as substance use concerns. More specifically, he's been smoking weed daily and he also consumes alcohol occasionally. So, as we move through this training, I want you to keep Kaleo in mind as we explore vulnerability, red flags, and trauma informed care. Okay. So, substances can affect decision making as well as perception of risk, especially in developing adolescent brains. When youth are focused on meeting immediate needs, avoiding withdrawal, getting high, or maybe even just staying connected, they may tolerate unsafe relationships or situations that they otherwise wouldn't. This is vulnerability, not consent. So we will, in terms of when we view substance use as a vulnerability factor, um, we want to be sure that we look at it as such as opposed to a moral failure. Okay, so we're going to view again substance use as a vulnerability factor. So, substance use basically increases vulnerability in very real ways, right? And that's because it impairs judgment. It also increases dependency, and it can also isolate youth from safer relationships. So, for some youth, substances are used to numb the effects of trauma. For others, they are used to just stay awake for safety, maintain anxiety, or perhaps even cope with ongoing stress related to instability or housing insecurity. Substance use is rarely about getting high, it's about getting through. Okay, so this is context, not character. So now what we're looking at is that when we look at substance use and sex trafficking or even human trafficking, we see that there is a bilateral relationship. Okay, so this relationship goes both ways and often unfolds time rather slowly. Okay, so it unfolds over time as opposed to unfolding all at once. So substance use can increase vulnerability to trafficking by impairing judgment, increasing risk taking, as well as creating unmet needs related to money, shelter, or even access to substances. These vulnerabilities can make youth more susceptible to individuals who appear to offer protection, resources, or belonging. And belonging meaning the sense of belonging. Okay? So at the same time, trafficking frequently increases or initiates substance use. Many trafficked youth report being introduced to substances by the exploiters as a way to build trust, reduce resistance, or even create dependency. So, in some cases, youth are pressured or even required to use substances to stay compliant, to manage long hours, or to numb the emotional as well as the physical pain. Over time, substances can serve dual and overlapping roles. They may function as a coping mechanism, helping youth manage trauma, fear, exhaustion, or even that chronic stress, while also becoming a tool of control used by the exploiters to maintain dependency, limit autonomy, as well as increase isolation. So, as this cycle continues, substance use can deepen vulnerability, making it increasingly difficult for the youth to recognize exploitation or safely exit the situation. All right. So, adolescents are biologically and developmentally wired for connection. During this stage of life, the brain systems responsible for social bonding, reward, as well as emotional intensity are highly active, right? While the areas responsible for impulse control, risk management, and low term planning are still developing. So the imbalance can definitely make relationships feel especially powerful and emotionally urgent for youth. So, because connection is a primary developmental task, adolescents may prioritize relationships, even when those relationships are unhealthy or unsafe. If they provide a sense of belonging, protection, validation, or access to their basic needs. Okay? So, for youth experiencing instability, trauma, or unmet needs, these relationships may also serve as survival functions, such as providing shelter, transportation, access to substances, as well as emotional support. So, in this context, manipulation and exploitation may not be experienced as harmful at first. Instead, can feel relational, protective, or maybe even necessary. So, tactics such as grooming, cohesion, or control may be normalized or maybe even misinterpreted as care, loyalty, or even love. So, as a result, youth may struggle to recognize warning signs, maybe even set healthy boundaries, or even seek help, especially if doing so threatens the loss of connection or what they perceive as safety. So, understanding this developmental reality helps to shift our lens away from blame and towards compassion, emphasizing the importance of consistent, supportive relationships and trauma informed responses that meet youth's needs for connection in safer ways. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at situational and system level risks of factors. Okay? And this is because many trafficked youth are already known to multiple systems, such as the welfare system, education, juvenile justice, behavioral health, or maybe even housing services. While these systems are designed to provide support and protection, frequent involvement can also mean repeated transitions between homes, schools, placements, as well as providers, which can unintentionally increase isolation as well as instability. So, each transition has the potential to disrupt relationships with trusted adults, peers, as well as service providers. As protective connections weaken, the youth may seek consistency, belonging, and resources elsewhere, right? And sometimes from individuals who recognize and exploit these unmet needs. So the gaps in communication between systems, service delays, or maybe even inconsistent responses can further compound the vulnerability. So, within these contexts, substance use may emerge or escalate as a way to cope with stress, loss, uncertainty, or even the lack of control. Substances can also become one of the few constants in a youth's life, reinforcing dependence as well as increasing exposure to unsafe relationships. Now, understanding the cumulative, impact of system involvement helps to shift the focus from individual behavior to the broader environment, shaping risk as well as vulnerability. Okay. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I just want to briefly introduce a lens that helps explain why substance use can increase vulnerability, especially for youth who have experienced trauma. Now, this isn't about diagnosing or labeling, it's really about understanding behavior as a response to pain. For many youth, substance use and other high risk behaviors doesn't start with addiction. They start with pain, distress, or perhaps having those unmet needs. So the behavior brings temporary relief, but over time, it creates more complications, more distress, and greater dependency. Okay? So, this cycle helps us understand why simply telling a youth to stop using or even questioning their choices often doesn't work. The behavior is serving a function. Okay, so we'll start with pain. So, pain, trauma, or distress, right? So, the youth experience psychological pain, whether it be in the form of fear, shame, or abandonment. They also experience these physiological stress responses. Some of them have even encountered trauma, whether it be abuse, neglect, violence, or maybe even that instability. Okay. In trafficking contexts, many youth already carry trauma before the exploitation even begins. Okay. So next we have the avoid, right? And this is sort of coping through avoidance. The goal here is to escape pain. So our youth turn to substances, maybe even engage in high risk behaviors. They might be even engaging in sexual acting out behaviors as well. Relationships that feel protective or validating. Okay. So they go to those types of relationships, which again could be unhealthy or it could be those that are exploiting them. So these behaviors are not about pleasure, they're really about survival as well as relief. And this is where hooked begins. Okay. So substances and relationships become tools to avoid the unbearable feelings that they often encounter. So next we have the temporary relief. Okay. So this is sort of how avoidance works. Briefly, right? So the nervous system calms, the emotional pain dulls, fear feels manageable. But the brain learns that this works, do it again. So traffickers exploit this exact moment, offering substances, affection, protection, and the sense of belonging. So then we move on to the continual stage. So because relief is short lived, youth must use more frequently, take greater risk, or maybe even stay connected to the people who provide access. At this point, dependency forms and the control shifts outward. So choices narrow as a result, and this is the trapped phase. So the youth is no longer just avoiding pain, they are avoiding withdrawal, fear, as well as emotional collapse. Okay? And then we have life complications. So to add salt to injury, here we have the continued use occurs because or leads to, in fact, some legal issues. The youth is disengaged from school, so slowly not showing up. There's also increased family conflict, maybe even increased violence, deeper trauma, which creates more pain, and the cycle repeats. Right? So exploitation thrives. I'm sorry. When we look at this type of exploitation during this cycle of pain, it really thrives because the youth feel that they have no other option. Leaving feels more dangerous than staying. And in fact, the substance and the relationships are now intertwined. Okay. All right. So, why this model is so important is because this helps us to understand why the youth don't just leave. It helps us understand why substance use is a leash, it's not a flaw, and why the traffickers don't need physical force sometimes. Okay. And also why shame based approaches fail. And lastly, why relationship based trauma informed care is essential. Okay. So substance use is often not the problem. It is the solution that the youth found when no safer one was available to them. All right, so we're going to bring back Khalil. Okay, so Khalil initially used cannabis to cope with stress and sleep difficulties. Over time, his use increased and access became dependent on older peers. Okay, so here I'd like us to sort of look at where do you see vulnerability, meaning no choice in the situation. Okay, so if you have any ideas, feel free to drop it in the chat and then Diane will read it out loud for us. So, based on what I just shared, cannabis is used for coping, increase to daily use, dependency on older peers for access, and sort of that his substance is tied to relationships. Where do you see vulnerability?
Allie says substance use tied to relationships. Aniko says dependence.
Absolutely, right? So I want to just repeat what Diane said. And absolutely, substance is tied to relationships, and then there's a dependence, right? And then there's also the fact that substance use is a coping mechanism and that the escalation is increased to now daily use. Okay? And the other last one that we don't want to forget about too is there's an increased reliance, right? So there's that reduced autonomy as a result. So the vulnerability is, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add, we have older peers, substance tied to relationships, coping using substance dependence in relationships. Again, older peers and coping.
Yeah. Okay. So we hit them all, right? And that is the coping, the older peers, substance tied to relationships, etc. Okay. And then again, the increased reliance. So the vulnerability is not the substance itself. It is how substance use narrows options and increases reliance on others, which can quickly increase risk for exploitation. So our role is awareness, safety, and connection, not investigation, unless, of course, that is your specific role. Okay. So, as we wrap up this particular section, here are some key takeaways. So, as helping professionals, you may be one of the few consistent adults in a young person's life. Sometimes the only adult who actually shows up predictably, listens without judgment, and remains present throughout change. That consistency alone can be a powerful protective factor, especially for youth who have experienced instability, trauma, or even frequent transitions across the systems. Now, when we recognize substance use as a possible signal of deeper vulnerability rather than simply a behavior to correct or respond, our response really shifts to instead of punishment, judgment, or dismissal, we actually lead with curiosity, empathy, as well as care. So we start to begin asking different kinds of questions, not why are you doing this, but more, what is this helping you manage? Or maybe even, what need is going unmet right now? So the shift really matters because early supportive responses can interrupt patterns of isolation and risk before they escalate. Awareness alone allows us to strengthen connection, engage, supports, as well as collaborate across systems. While the youth is still reachable and trust is still possible. So even small moments of attuned trauma informed response can really influence how safe a young person feels and whether they remain engaged and how likely they are to accept help over time. Okay. So, early awareness doesn't require having all the answers. It does require, however, us noticing, caring, and responding intentionally. And in many cases, that presence and consistency can truly change the trajectory of a young person's life. So, our role is awareness, safety, and connection, not investigation. Okay. So, if substance use treatment is not provided within your agency, connect the youth to programs that offer trauma informed supportive care in that way. All right, so now we're going to shift gears to looking at what are some of those red flags. Okay, so before we talk about specific red flags, I find it important to really ground ourselves in what we mean by that term and what we don't mean too. So, red flags are basically those signals of potential risk, right? They're not proof of trafficking or exploitation. There's no single behavior that confirms that a young person is being trafficked. And in fact, many of the indicators that we'll review today overlap with substance use, trauma responses, as well as survival strategies and the typical adolescent behaviors. Okay. So our goal is not to label, diagnose, or investigate, right? Our goal is really about awareness so that we notice patterns over time that may indicate that a young person's safety is compromised. When we hold red flags this way, they become tools for prevention and protection rather than sources of fear or overreaction. Okay? This mindset helps us to stay curious, grounded, as well as supportive, especially when the youth are not ready or able to name what they are experiencing. Eh, All right. Okay. So now we're going to look specifically at behavioral red flags, and then we're going to offer, um, and these tend to show up. Well, they're not extreme. I just want to put it that way. Okay, so they do show up often, and it changes, but it's not very extreme. So you may notice some shifts in the youth's mood or maybe even increased irritability, anxiety, emotional reactivity, because some youth become more withdrawn while others may appear more volatile or even defensive. Okay? Secrecy around relationships or whereabouts can increase, and trusted adults may suddenly be pushed away. Now, it's important to remember that these behaviors don't mean that the youth is being difficult or non-compliant. They may be basic signs that they're showing that the youth themselves is navigating stress, fear, control, or even pressure that they don't know how to articulate. Okay? So rather than confronting these behaviors, a trauma-informed response will ask, what might this behavior be protecting or communicating? Okay? So that's the behavioral context. So now we're going to look at substance related red flags. And this deserves just a little special attention because they are often misunderstood. Okay. So you might notice unexplained access to substances or maybe even reliance on others for supply, maybe money or even transportation, perhaps even changes in patterns, right? Such as escalation or maybe new substances. So escalation meaning the increase in their use, or maybe they're using new substances now, or taking even riskier use, okay, polysubstance. Um, Youth may also use substances more intentionally to cope with stress, exhaustion, fear, as well as their emotional pain. Okay? So, resistance to discussing substance use changes doesn't necessarily indicate denial or defiance. It may reflect fear of consequences, meaning loyalty to someone that they might be providing the access to them, or maybe even concern about losing the perceived safety or stability at this point. When substance use becomes tied to survival or relationships, it increases vulnerability, and that's the lens that we need to hold. Okay, the fact that substance use increases vulnerability. Hey, all right. So now we're looking at the context in terms of contextual as well as environmental red flags. Okay, so context matters, right? Just as much as the behavior itself. So we want to pay attention to changes in a youth's environment or relationships, sudden access again to gifts, money, rides, or even phones can signal dependency on someone outside their usual support system. Even an older or controlling partner or a peer in common can also be part of this contextual red flag. Housing instability, so the frequent youth who runs away, or maybe even increased absence from school, so disengaging or disconnecting from school, or even programs that they might be currently involved, whether it be substance use treatment, can also heighten vulnerability. Okay? So, online relationships, especially those that feel secretive, pressured, or emotionally intense, are another area to approach with curiosity. These red flags often appear gradually. Okay? So, it's the pattern over time, not the individual event, that matters most. So, now that we're kind of reviewed some common contextual and environmental risk factors, let's return back to our client, and that's Kaleo. Okay. All right, and then there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I think okay, here we go. Thank you. Okay, so when we look at Kaleo, some of the things that we definitely want to focus on is, again, context matters just as much as the behavior, right? So what we're seeing now with Kaleo is the housing instability, right? So that's still a risk factor, as well as the lack of consistent adult support significantly increases his vulnerability. So these conditions don't mean exploitation is happening, but they are definitely signaling risk. Okay, so we're going to pause on Kaleil's story here, and not because the work stops, but because in real life we often don't have full clarity. Right, in terms of what happens most is how we basically respond moving forward. Okay. So we're going to put this on hold, but we're going to go ahead and continue looking at other risks. And this is going to be system involved or situational risk factors. Okay. And what this involves really is that many of our youth, again, has experienced trafficking or exploitation, have already been involved with the systems, right? Whether it be child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral health, as well as educational placement, or in some cases, educational displacement. Okay? So prior abuse, neglect, or even complex trauma can also weaken the protective boundaries. Family conflict, lack of supervision, or even the economic instability can increase reliance on unsafe relationships. Mental health challenges without adequate support further compounds this risk. So it's critical to remember that system involvement itself can be a vulnerability. Okay? Not because systems cause trafficking, but because frequent transitions and fragmented relationships can increase isolation. Okay? So this reinforces why consistent, supportive adult relationships within programs matter so much. Okay. All right. So now we're going to just sort of wrap this part up in terms of here are our takeaways when we think of red flags, okay, or warning signs. So, recognizing red flags is really about noticing the changes over time and not making assumptions or even jumping to conclusions, right? Because many behaviors that we discuss overlap with trauma response, substance use, or even survival strategies. So, our role isn't to label or to diagnose, it's really about how do we stay aware, stay curious, and stay connected. When we approach red flags through these lenses, then we become the tools for protection rather than fear. Okay. All right. So here. Now we're going to talk a little bit about integrating the red flags, interpreting, sorry, the red flags through a trauma-informed lens. Okay. Because how we interpret and respond to red flags is just as important as recognizing them. A trauma informed lens shifts the question again from what's wrong with this youth to what might be happening around this youth. Okay? Our focus really should be on safety and connection, not confrontation or demands for disclosure. The youth may not have the language, insight, or even safety to name exploitation, to name directly the exploitation that's going on. Okay. So pressuring them to disclose and increase the risk is only going to shut them down and impact the trust that we're trying to establish with them. So we want to be curious, right? So we use curiosity, consistency, and collaboration. We want to be able to document the observations rather than trying to document our assumptions. Okay. And we want to also remember that we do not need to carry these concerns alone, right? That's where consultation and collaboration are essential. Okay. Because our role is awareness, safety, and connection, not investigation. So, with that said, I leave this question. Which of these flags that we've talked about have you seen before, but maybe interpreted it differently? Okay, so some of the red flags that we talked about, are there any that you've seen before and maybe saw it differently or interpreted it differently? So, which of these red flags have you seen before but maybe interpreted differently? Okay, so I'm going to quick.
Kim's,
Oh,
sorry, Mary. Kim states disruption in school routine, unstable housing, older partner peer. Jackie says avoidance. Anika says runaway.
yeah, absolutely. So we got the runaway, we got the avoidance, the older peer connections. Absolutely. Okay. All right. So, recognizing these red flags doesn't obligate a young person to disclose anything, right? Many youth experiencing exploitation, in fact, do not identify themselves as victims. They might also fear consequences or even might feel loyalty to someone who meets their needs. So, because of this, how we respond matters more than what we uncover. So the response that feels interrogative, rushed, or maybe even authoritative can shut down trust and increase the risk. So a response that centers on safety, patience, and consistency can really create those conditions where disclosure or a safer decision making, discussion, conversation can become more apparent. Okay? So again, our role is not to extract information, it's to create a safe environment. All right. Okay. So some core principles around trauma-informed care. So I know many of you had ample training, continue to get training, and we continue to grow in this particular area. So some of this might be redundant to you, but it is always worth repeating. Okay? And that is that trauma informed care really asks us to assume that trauma may be present even when it has not been disclosed. These principles guide how we interact, speak, as well as set expectations. So, for the youth who may be experiencing exploitation, choice and control are especially crucial. Okay? So, trafficking is fundamentally about loss of control. So, when we unintentionally move that choice or take that choice away from them, we remove that choice through pressure, ultimatums, or forced conversations, we can replicate that harm. So, trauma informed care does not mean avoiding those hard topics. What it really means is approaching it with care, pacing, and more importantly, respect. Okay. So, a trauma informed response sounds again like curiosity rather than accusation. Okay, so I'll give another example. So instead of asking, why didn't you tell me this? We might say, I've noticed some changes and I want to check in about how things have been feeling for you. Okay. Youth may minimize, they might deny, or they might even deflect. And it's not because they are dishonest, but because disclosure may be unsafe. And again, our job isn't to push past those boundaries, but to leave the door open. Okay. Now we're going to look at cultural responses. Okay. So cultural responsiveness is not an add-on, right? It is essential for safety and engagement because some youth may avoid disclosure due to fear of bringing shame to their family or their community. Others may have learned not to trust systems because of past harm or discrimination. Direct questioning or authority-based approaches can unintentionally increase that withdrawal. So culturally responsive care asks us to slow down, listen, and adapt, not assume. It also asks us to recognize strengths, not just risk, within the family as well as the community. Okay, what are those strengths? Okay. So, even well intended responses can cause harm if they increase fear or even pressure. Okay, so confrontation may escalate danger. Ultimatums may push youth further into those unsafe relationships, and promising confidentiality when mandated reporting may also apply, can break that trust. So it is also critical not to carry these concerns alone, right? Consultation, again, protects youth as well as professionals. Collaboration is a trauma informed practice. So before we move into takeaways, I want to return back to Kaleo. Okay. This is an opportunity for us to practice our role, not as investigators, but as supportive adults, focus on awareness, safety, and connection. Now, what I didn't share earlier is that Cleo is transgender. I'm sharing this not as a defining detail, right? Because it really doesn't matter. Because when we look at gender, identity, culture, human trafficking is not a respecter of persons. It affects all communities, all cultures, all identities, as well as all genders. Okay. All right. So here we have Kaleo. Okay. So engaging Kaleo, again, isn't about extracting information. It's really about creating conditions where safety, trust, and dignity can make connection possible, especially at the intersections of culture, identity, trauma, as well as substance use. Okay? So safety before disclosure. So before asking for information or clarity, the priority is ensuring emotional, physical, as well as relational safety. Youth who have experienced trauma, system involvement, or maybe even identity based harm may not feel safe disclosing details, especially if disclosure has previously led to punishment, removal, or even rejection. So for Kaleo, safety may mean knowing that he won't get in trouble for being honest, understanding that disclosure won't automatically trigger loss of housing, relationships, or autonomy. Okay? And that experiencing consistency and predictability is how adults respond. Also, that safety is created through tone, through pace, confidentiality, transparency, respect, and that he doesn't feel any pressure. Now, let's look at relationships specifically, okay? And that's because trust develops through presence, right? And it doesn't get developed through questioning. In fact, many youth have learned that adults gather information and then they disappear, or things escalate as a result, or to sometimes pass them to another system. So, focusing on relationships first communicates that the youth matters beyond the information that they provide. Okay? So, for Kaleo, this might look like spending time talking about daily life, his interests, or maybe even goals before addressing concerns, showing up consistently, even when there is no progress to report. Okay? Demonstrating reliability, following through on even the smallest commitments. And then the relationship itself becomes the intervention. Okay? All right. So when we look at trauma informed and culturally responsive takeaways, um, what I really want you to be able to see is it's all about how we show up, right? Because trauma informed, culturally responsive care really allows us to create that space for safety, even when answers are unclear. And that through our consistency, curiosity, and respect, that this is where most of those protective factors of that this young person has at this point. Okay. And as a result, remember that collaboration is not a failure, that it is a strength, that it's not us who has to rescue this individual, right? More people involved in terms of resources, the more opportunity the youth will have. Okay? So once we understand how to respond safely and then respectfully, the next question really becomes how do we prevent harm and work together so that the youth doesn't fall through the cracks? And so this is where prevention starts. Okay. So prevention doesn't only happen upstream or in specialized trafficking programs, it happens where the youth already are. Right, including the substance use treatment, prevention, school based, or even community programs that they're involved in. Every time a youth experiences consistency, respect, and follow through, we are strengthening protective factors. In fact, many youth who experience exploitation report that no adult noticed or stayed long enough to notice. So our presence and consistency matters more than we realize. Okay? So prevention is not about predicting trafficking, it's about reducing vulnerability and increasing connection. All right. Okay. So Substance use programs are uniquely positioned to be able to build protective factors just because they offer regular contact over time, right? And this includes the other like residential programs or other programs within the community that you might be a part of where there is that regular contact. Okay. So when youth feel judged or even punished for substance use, the vulnerability increases. When youth feel supported, on the other hand, even when struggling, risk decreases. Okay? So teaching coping skills, emotional regulations, our boundaries is not just treatment work. It's really traffic prevention. So every protective factor that we strengthen reduces the reliance on unsafe relationships. Now, there is no single provider, program, or system that can prevent trafficking alone. Collaboration is not optional, it is a safety strategy. So, when professionals work in isolation, risk increases. When teams communicate, consult, and coordinate, the youth are safer. So, collaboration also protects you as a professional by ensuring decisions are shared, and it also protects the youth as well. So this is not about over-reporting or escalating prematurely. What it really is, it's about not carrying the concern alone. Now, when we think about our roles, right? So clarity around role boundaries is essential for ethical as well as trauma-informed practice. So our responsibility is to notice, to document, to consult, as well as to connect, right? Not to investigate or even confirm that there is exploitation going on. So acting outside our role unintentionally can also increase the risk for the youth. Okay. So, when substance use treatment, for example, is outside of your agency's scope, referral to a trauma informed provider is not a failure, right? It's really more about responsible care. Yeah. Now, a coordinated response doesn't mean that is involved at once. It means that it is intentional, it is paced, and it involves collaboration. Okay, so it's paced collaboration. So you might start with supervision. You might identify who needs to know and why. You might also share just some of the observations, not your assumptions, and keep the youth's safety and voice central whenever possible. Okay? So when the systems work together thoughtfully, the youth experience less fragmentation, less re-traumatization, and has more support. Okay. So I just want to share this with you. You probably heard about this just recently, and just this just speaks to the volume of the importance of collaboration. And more importantly, I hope that this gives us hope in the field that we're working with, especially with folks that are sexually exploited and trafficked. Okay, so this was a coordinated response, right? And this was and what's beautiful about it is happened right here in Hawaii, right? And this was the Operation Shine on the Light. So I'm just going to play a very short clip. Oop. Are you folks still able to see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Joint investigation found 8 endangered missing children on Oahu. The FBI, Secret Service, HPD, and other agencies partnered in the child recovery operation over the weekend, known as Operation Shine the Light. The 8 children they found were between 13 and 17 years old. 2 of them ran away more than a year ago. The operation was done during National Human Trafficking Awareness Month.
Okay, let me quick close this. All right. Okay, so as we wrap up and conclude with our informational training today is sort of prevention and collaboration. So when we look at this, really the takeaways is um, to remember that prevention is not about doing more. It's really about doing what we already do with intention. The relationships that we have matter. Your observations matter. Your willingness to consult and collaborate matters, and that you are not expected to solve trafficking. You are expected to reduce vulnerability, strengthen protection, and stay connected. And this is the powerful work that we do. Okay? So as we close, the last thing I kind of want us to do is I just want you to put your feet down to the ground. And I just want us to feel grounded as we end our time together. Okay. And then I want you to just take a very deep breath. Okay. Inhale, exhale. Okay, so let's do it again. Let's take a deep breath in and let's just exhale with might. Okay. And as we leave today, some things that we can just sort of think about is what is one thing that you might be leading with today? Whether it be a new lens, maybe a reminder, or just a sense of clarity, or maybe now you're asking yourself, what is the next step? Okay. So as we wrap up, what is one thing that you might be leading with today? So feel free to drop it in the chat.
Share observations, not assumptions, more understanding, hope, clarity. Make observations, not assumptions. Again, what is the next step? Hope again. Not react, build relationship. Hope and hope. Relationships matter. Hope again. Do with intention. Creating relationships before expecting answers.
Awesome. Wonderful. And thank you all so much because having that hope is vital. It allows us to continue and recognizing that it happens, right? In terms of we can build and perpetuate that hope through the relationships and connections that we build.
We have a couple more here, Mary. Meeting clients where they are at, but not leaving them where they are at. Mindfulness of culture. Great speakers, smooth presentation, and natural. That's from Heather.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. All right. Well, thank you all so much. And it is a pleasure to have seen how many of you are on the training. And I hope that this has helped you in some way.
And does anyone have any questions before we go? We have about 2.5 minutes. You can unmute or put it in the chat. There's lots of love in the chat, Mary. I don't know if you can see it.
Okay.
Well, while you're thinking about your questions, just make a quick announcement that tomorrow our speakers are from the Children's Justice Center across the state. On Wednesday, we are Oceania. And on Thursday, we end with the Hawaii State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So those of you who have been with us this month, thank you so much. And we hope to see you in the next 3 days. And final call for questions is 12:58.
And to answer one of the questions, yeah, I will definitely provide the slides to you. So if Diane is able to get them all out to you, I'll be sure you have copies of it.
Yes, I can do that. And this was being recorded, so the recordings will all be on our website between mid and late February. At least that's the estimated date.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, thanks again, everyone. Thank you so much, Mary. Very much appreciate your time and your ike, your mana'o, and for sharing this space with us and everyone else as well. Thank you.
Awesome. You're welcome. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Ahoy ho. Bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.